Why would the most profitable woman in the world, the blonde bombshell who generated more revenue than a fleet of oil tankers for 20th Century-Fox, simply vanish? In the winter of 1954, at the absolute zenith of her fame, Marilyn Monroe walked out of Hollywood, broke her iron-clad contract, and disappeared. The studio heads told the press she was having a nervous breakdown. The gossip columnists called it career suicide. They were all lying. It wasn't a breakdown. It was a declaration of war. The year was 1954, and Marilyn Monroe was less a person and more a national resource. She was the sun around which the Fox solar system revolved, the engine that powered a multi-million-dollar studio. Her films, like Gentlemen Prefer Blondes and How to Marry a Millionaire, were cinematic gold, turning breathtaking profits on modest budgets. She was, by every metric, the most valuable asset in the entertainment industry, a living, breathing mint that printed money just by stepping in front of a camera. But the architect of this empire, the man who believed he had forged her from nothing, studio chief Darryl F. Zanuck, saw her not as an artist, but as a product, a beautifully crafted, exquisitely profitable, an utterly obedient piece of machinery. She was trapped in a contract she had signed years earlier, a relic from a time when she was a desperate unknown. It paid her a mere $1,500 a week, a pittance compared to the fortunes being made by her male co-stars, some of whom earned over $100,000 per picture. She had no say in her scripts, no choice of director, no voice in the characters she was forced to inhabit. Zanuck and his executives saw her as a caricature, a wind-up doll with platinum hair and a breathy voice, and they intended to milk that caricature until it was dry. The next film they had for her was a musical comedy titled The Girl in Pink Tights. The script was dreadful, a recycled plot with forgettable songs. It was another cog in the dumb blonde machine. For years, she had pleaded for better roles, for the chance to prove she was more than the sum of her measurements. She studied Chekhov and dreamed of playing Grushenka in The Brothers Karamazov. The studio bosses just laughed. To them, her artistic ambitions were a joke, the quaint delusions of a pretty girl who didn't understand her own function. She was property, and in the Hollywood of the 1950s, property did not have an opinion. So when she refused to report for work on The Girl in Pink Tights, the studio acted swiftly, doing exactly what they had always done to disobedient stars. On January 15, 1955, they officially suspended her. The press release was brutal. It painted her as unstable, unprofessional, and profoundly ungrateful, a fragile star collapsing under the pressure of her own fame. It was a checkmate. Zanuck believed he had her cornered. Without Fox, she would have no income, no platform, no career. She would come crawling back, humbled and ready to put on the pink tights. He had made the single greatest miscalculation of his career, because the suspension letter wasn't a punishment. It was the key that unlocked the cage. She didn't fight it. She didn't protest. She simply packed a single suitcase, slipped out of her Beverly Hills home in the dead of night, and took a flight to the East Coast, disappearing from the world that had created her. The headlines screamed about a mental collapse, a star on the verge of a breakdown. The truth was infinitely more dangerous. She wasn't running from a career. She was running towards a conspiracy, a meticulously planned corporate coup that had been months in the making. She wasn't retreating to a hospital. She was rendezvousing with her co-conspirator. His name was Milton H. Greene, a celebrated fashion photographer from New York. Greene was everything the Hollywood moguls were not. He was an artist who saw past the blonde caricature and into the soul of the fiercely intelligent, ambitious woman trapped inside. During a photo shoot in California, they had formed an immediate and intense bond. He listened to her frustrations, her dreams of becoming a serious actress, her fury at being treated like a beautiful simpleton. While Zanuck saw a commodity, Greene saw a revolutionary waiting for a spark. And in the quiet conversations between camera flashes, a secret plan was born. Marilyn fled not to a place of rest, but to Greene's rustic home in Weston, Connecticut. There, far from the prying eyes of the Hollywood press, they transformed the quaint farmhouse into a corporate war room. For weeks, they worked in secret, fueled by coffee and revolutionary fervor. They huddled with lawyers, studied corporate law, and mapped out a future that the studio system was designed to prevent. They weren't just planning an escape. They were building a weapon, a company that would not only grant Marilyn her freedom, but would also have the power to challenge the very foundation of Hollywood's feudal structure. A production company, owned and controlled by the artist herself. They named it Marilyn Monroe Productions. The first employee was its president, Marilyn. The vice president was Milton Greene. On the surface, it was a simple piece of paper, a standard certificate of incorporation filed in the state of New York. But in reality, It was a stick of dynamite, placed at the base of the studio gates. While Hollywood partied on New Year's Eve, toasting the end of 1954, Marilyn Monroe was in a lawyer's office, quietly executing the document that made her the second woman in America since Mary Pickford, decades earlier, to own her own production company. She was now, legally, her own boss. But a company on paper was one thing. A company with the power to produce films, to hire talent, and to negotiate with the titans who had owned her was another. Fox still held her original contract. They considered her new corporation a fantasy, a legal fiction. So Marilyn made her next calculated move. She didn't stay hidden in Connecticut. She moved into a suite at the Ambassador Hotel in Manhattan and began a public campaign of reinvention. This was not a vacation. It was phase 2 of the operation. She enrolled in the Actors Studio, sitting in classes alongside Marlon Brando and Kim Stanley, studying The Method under the legendary Lee Strasberg. Hollywood scoffed. The press ran mocking articles, juxtaposing photos of her in revealing gowns with her new, bookish persona. They called her an egghead, predicting this intellectual phase would pass as quickly as a fashion trend. They saw a confused girl playing make-believe. They failed to see the shrewd businesswoman building value in her primary asset, herself. Every class she took, every intellectual she was seen with, every step she took away from the dumb blonde image was a deliberate act of corporate branding. She was increasing the market value of Marilyn Monroe Productions before it had even produced a single frame of film. Meanwhile, behind the scenes, Milton Green was the field general, securing financing and forging alliances. They were building an arsenal for the inevitable confrontation. They knew Fox wouldn't let their biggest star go without a fight to the death. The whispers of her new corporation finally reached the ears of Darryl F. Zanuck in California. His initial amusement quickly curdled into incandescent rage. This wasn't just a contract dispute. This was an insurrection. This was theft of his property. His response was swift and merciless. Fox's legal department launched a multi-million-dollar lawsuit against Marilyn and her fledgling company, aiming to bury them in litigation fees until they were bankrupt. Simultaneously, the studio's formidable publicity machine began a coordinated smear campaign, feeding stories to their network of loyal gossip columnists. The narrative was carefully crafted. Marilyn wasn't just difficult. She was under the thumb of a Svengali-like Milton Green, a conniving opportunist who was poisoning her mind and destroying her career for his own gain. They portrayed her as mentally fragile, easily manipulated, and dangerously delusional. It was an attempt to utterly discredit her in the eyes of the public and the industry. But Marilyn Monroe was done hiding. She was done being silent. Instead of retreating, she launched a counteroffensive. On a cold February morning, she invited over 50 reporters and photographers into Milton Green's small New York apartment. There was no studio handler, no prepared statement written by a publicist. It was just her. She sat on a grand piano, dressed in a simple black dress, and faced the media circus head-on. She was not the weeping, hysterical victim they had been led to expect. She was calm, articulate, and fiercely in command of her own story. She explained, in her own words, why she had left Hollywood. She spoke of her desire for better roles, for creative respect, for the right to grow as an artist. She announced the goals of Marilyn Monroe Productions: to make quality films, independently. Then, she laid out her non-negotiable terms for any potential return to Fox: full script and director approval, the right to work for other studios, and a new salary of $100,000 per film. It was an unprecedented set of demands for any actor, let alone a woman, in an industry run by autocrats. It wasn't a plea. It was an ultimatum. Zanuck's answer was the ultimate insult. He would not negotiate with a traitor. Instead, he would erase her. He publicly announced that Marilyn Monroe was finished at Fox and introduced her replacement, a vivacious, blonde dancer named Cherie North. The studio machine pushed North into the roles Marilyn had refused, dressed her in Marilyn's costumes, and promoted her as the newer, more obedient model. The message was clear and cruel. Marilyn Monroe was not unique. She was replaceable. A collection of parts platinum hair, a wiggle, a whisper that could be easily swapped out. The war had begun, and the first brutal volley had been fired directly at her. The press, once her allies, now treated her like a fool who had thrown away a fairy tale life. Hollywood friends stopped returning her calls, terrified of being blacklisted by the powerful Zanuck. The lawsuit loomed, threatening to drain every dollar she had ever earned. The studio that had built her was now systematically trying to dismantle her, piece by piece, in front of the entire world. She was alone, an independent contractor with a phantom company, squaring off against a monolithic corporation with an army of lawyers and a seemingly endless supply of money. They had created the dumb blonde, and now the dumb blonde was coming to burn their kingdom to the ground. The kingdom began to crumble not with a bang, but with the quiet sound of empty cinema seats. Zanuck's Gambit, his new Marilyn, was a catastrophic failure. The films intended for Monroe, now starring Cherie North, underperformed at the box office. The public didn't want a replacement. They wanted the original. Every ticket that went unsold was a vote cast for Marilyn, a quiet protest from millions of fans who understood something the studio moguls did not. You cannot manufacture lightning in a bottle. Marilyn Monroe was not a formula. She was an event. Months turned into a year. The war of attrition was taking its toll on both sides. Marilyn's funds were dwindling under the constant assault of legal fees, but she refused to break. Fox, meanwhile, was hemorrhaging money on films that lacked their key ingredient, their Midas touch. The lawsuit, once Zanuck's primary weapon, was now a monument to his own stubborn ego, costing the studio millions with no victory in sight. He had tried to starve her out, but instead, he was starving his own studio of its most profitable asset. The stalemate had to end. The king was losing his kingdom. In early 1956, the white flag was raised, not in a press conference, but in a quiet summons to a lawyer's office. Darryl F. Zanuck, the man who swore he would destroy her, was forced to capitulate. The negotiations were brutal, but the leverage was all hers. When the ink was dry, Marilyn Monroe hadn't just won. She had dictated the terms of surrender. The old contract was torn up. The lawsuit was dropped. She was awarded a new 7-year, 4-picture deal worth $8 million in today's money. And, most importantly, she received everything she had demanded on that fateful day in Milton Green's apartment. She walked back through the gates of 20th Century-Fox, not as a prodigal daughter, but as a conquering sovereign. Her first film under the New Deal was Bus Stop. It was a role she chose, with a director she approved. For her performance, she earned some of the best reviews of her career, silencing the critics who had called her an egghead, and proving her artistic instincts were not just valid, but brilliant. She had gone to war with a titan, and brought him to his knees. It was a victory that sent shockwaves through the industry, forever altering the balance of power between stars and studios. Marilyn Monroe Productions would go on to co-produce The Prince and the Showgirl, making her the second woman in Hollywood, after Mary Pickford, to own her own production company. She had transformed herself from a piece of property into a proprietor, from a beautiful object into the architect of her own career. The world would forever remember the icon, the bombshell, the legend. But the truth is far more powerful. She was a revolutionary, disguised in platinum blonde, who fought the empire and won. To uncover more of the untold stories and walk the road she paved, from the casting couches to the corridors of power, subscribe to the channel that understands the woman behind the myth. Welcome to Boulevard of Monroe.